We are now going to have an interview of Mr. Pat Speer, who is a JFK assassination researcher. He has been a researcher for decades. He's well known in the research community, and he's very knowledgeable. And above all, I think he's a very honest researcher. He's known for that, and he's always open to respectful debate, as long as you provide sound arguments. And he's well known to be an expert and in the medical aspect of the case. So we're going to talk to him today, and I'm happy to welcome him. Good evening or good morning, Mr. Speer. And after a brief introduction, I will ask you to tell us about your intellectual path in your research, the research community, the research into the Kennedy assassination. Did it start with the JFK movie by Oliver Stone or anything else? Then, what is important, the question I will ask you, we will go on, is what are your conclusions? What is your position today? What's your stance? What conclusions have you reached in the Kennedy assassination controversy or mystery? And what is going to be important as a follow-up question? What arguments do you put forward to support your position today? That is going to be interesting. Okay. Okay, who are you then?
Well, my name's Pat Speer, or Patrick Speer, and I'm from the San Fernando Valley, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and I grew up, going to public school, and my family was, pretty middle class, and I, I did well in school, and I took some college, and then I thought I was going to be a rock star, so I don't know what I wanted, but I wanted to make music. So I kind of dropped out, and then I got a musician friend said, "Hey, work at this record company." So I worked at a record company for 15 years, 13 years, I guess, and really built it up. We were a distributor to all record stores. There used to be these things called record stores. Young people watching this probably don't realize that, but there used to be record stores. And we were a wholesaler to record stores, and I actually got really involved in the independent music scene in was carrying lots of small labels that were making them available to small record stores. And it really, sales went up over 1,000% while I was there. And it was really becoming a scene, punk rock and stuff, Nirvana. These bands really took off while I was, buying. And then corruption, criminality, that all went away. And so then I was like, well, I want to write a screenplay about what I saw in the record industry, because I think people find that interesting. Because beyond working at a distributor, and it sounds boring as heck, I would go to parties and there I'd be smoking pot with Snoop Dogg or meeting Prince, and Prince introduced me to his wife. Weird stuff like that. So it was this weird life I lived. Anyhow, then so I wrote a screenplay about that, and then I'm like, well, screenplays are something which you got to put aside because if you write about yourself, you're not a good judge. They always say that in order to make a good screenplay, you have to kill your darlings, or you have to get rid of your pet theories, what you like, the things that sound neat to you. If they don't serve the purpose of the story, you got to push them aside. So I put it aside, and I thought, what else would I like to write about? And I was like, well, I've always been interested in the Kennedy assassination because I had a friend, my musician friend, his name was Chris Musio. He was always talking about Rush to Judgment and Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. And then when the movie JFK came out, I saw that, and I was intrigued by that. And I bought Robert Groden's book, The Killing of a President. And then there was a guy named Jim McCall, who was a sales rep when I was in the record industry, who gave me a T-shirt that had JFK. It had Oswald getting killed, but it was for a record company. So it had they were like Oswald was holding a microphone. It was pretty funny, I thought. Bad taste, of course, black humor. But anyhow, so he was interested in it. So I, to have conversation with him, because I was interested myself, I started picking up books. So I picked up Case Closed by Gerald Posner, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of BS out there that, you can't just trust one source. that was what Gerald Posner taught me. I don't really believe much of what he said, but he did teach me that you can't trust one source, because he pointed out a lot of flaws and a lot of arguments, and a lot of what he said was, I ended up believing was probably accurate. But I also had problem with some of the things he did, like he had an illustration depicting the single bullet theory. And I'm like, I'm not buying this. JFK was like this. It's like, why are they lifting his shoulder? Oh, it's because the bullet hole is on the shoulder. And in order to make it come out the throat, they need his shoulders to be up like this. So I was really discouraged by that. And so then I started looking, and I found articles online. I think they were written by Harold Weisberg originally, where they attack Posner's book. And so I was going back and forth. And then I found John McAdams' website, which had lots of arguments. And I found Rex Bradford's website, which was called History Matters. And eventually he expanded it. Basically, a lot of the same material ended up on the Mary Farrell Foundation website, which he also runs. But on History Matters, I found the HSCA report, which is not, the Warren Commission, 26 volumes. If you go to a library, you're probably going to find a couple volumes, and maybe eventually you'll find all of them. That material is around. No, I think there was only something like 100 or 200 copies of the HSCA report even made of the volumes. You could buy the paperback of the. So most people never read that stuff. So I started reading, and I got sucked in. Then I was sucked in because I started realizing things that made no sense to me. Like there was an autopsy photo, which was in Grodin's book, which is what they call the mystery photo. And it's a photo of Kennedy's skull with the scalp retracted or reflected and the brain removed. And to me, I said, well, that's the back of the head. And then when I'm reading through the HSCA report, I'm like, that's the forehead? I was like, what? And so I ended up really getting sucked down that rabbit hole. And I made a video series with a friend of mine who I'd known since second grade. And we made this video series, The Mysterious Death of Number 35, one of the first YouTube video series to have like original material, as opposed to going like, here's a approved film. Look, the guy gets killed. I was like, this is what my research shows. And Brad knew how to animate it. And it got good reviews and people really liked it. And Jim DiEugenio gave it a plus or a thumbs up. So then I was speaking at conferences, and then I moved in with a woman. We have a child, where she's my wife, Bridget. And so that became, after a couple of years, I kind of like balanced family life with research, but I continued to go to conferences and speak. And every now and then, every couple of years, I'd be like, well, what about the fingerprints? And so I get a deep dive, because that's my skill. Am I the smartest human being? No. Am I the funniest guy? Or no, whatever. But I do have a skill, and that's I can do a deep dive into something and really get into it. Like I'm someone who, as a kid, I collected baseball cards, and I just loved to just sit there in the middle of the room going like, okay, I'm going to put them in order by date of birth. I'm going to put them in order by home runs or whatever. I would put it because I liked sifting through large amounts of material and sorting it and making it line up in a way that I could understand. So I did that in various aspects of the case. And after a while, there's a pattern. And the pattern is that the Warren Commission was a rush to judgment. It was just like, okay, we need to say this. So they said it, and they took a lot of shortcuts. And they were, I don't think most of the people working for the Warren, probably none of them were out like, let's go lie. They just ended up doing it because that was just where the pressure was. They told some lies in order to make the pieces fit. If there was a round piece and a square peg and a round hole, they'd make it fit. They'd say, the shooting would be an example where they acted like Oswald. It was an easy shot for him, and it's just not true. Over and over again you find that stuff. But the more I was immersed in the research community, and I think this is one of the reasons why you wanted me on your show, I realized there's a lot of nonsense in the research world as well. And I know in your case, I believe you were really interested in David Lifton's stuff because it is interesting. And at a certain point, you realize, wait a second, he's really getting out there and he's really saying things that I think are nonsense. And, Lifton starts off with the premise that, oh, these Dallas doctors are truth tellers and they're great guys.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you get to the 90s, he's saying that they're like part of the cover-up and they're liars. And then before he died, he was saying that some of them were actually involved in the plot to kill Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's like, so, it's, so I spent a lot of time on the Education Forum, a website, and other forums as well. Used to be a Lancer forum, and then there's the JFK Assassination Forum, Duncan McCrae. And then, of course, John McAdams, who was the prominent professor at Marquette University, who became like the go-to guy for the American media. Like, oh, this old professor, he knows all about this stuff. And McAdams really wasn't that well informed. He had a lot of people around him who would help him. But I was on his website or his chat room or whatever you want to call it a lot. And I learned a lot from being on these because you develop arguments. You see what arguments work. You see which ones fail. You see the weaknesses in your argument. You see the weaknesses in other arguments. And sometimes someone will say, hey, what about this? And you're like, holy crap, I didn't even know about that. And so I've enjoyed a lot of time and wasted a lot of time as well on these arguments online. But I do think it's kind of like I don't even know, a feather blowing across the desert. But I think that there has been progress made. It's just slow, and it just goes into like, I don't know where it's heading, but I definitely think that there has been some progress made over the years. But for every 20 steps forward is 50 steps back or whatever.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. So let me ask you precisely, today, as of 2024, where do you stand? What conclusions have you reached that you are really convinced of today?
I am convinced that, let's start with the shooting. When I did a detailed study I went through all the witness statements, and then I started going like, well, what about when he spoke to the newspapers? And what about this? And so I ended up collecting probably 2 or 3 times as many statements as anybody else had collected at the time. And it's pretty clear when you look at the statements that, there aren't 10 shots from different locations like some people will tell you, but there's not 3 shots from behind either. I mean, a lot of people who were standing directly underneath the building, where when they tested for the HSA, which reinvestigated the case in the 70s, they did some shootings and tested how people would hear the shots. It was Professor David Green from Harvard, I think. And they said that it was easy to tell where the shots are coming from when you were standing in front of the building. And yet you look at what the witnesses who were standing in front of the building said, most of them said it came over from the right, from the train area, or the grass, what people would say the grassy knoll area. They said it came over from the right, from the west. So that was interesting. I think that there was a sound that came from that area. And then there's also a number of witnesses who say that they saw smoke in that area. So that led me to believe that maybe what people interpreted as the big loud bang at the end, the last shot, was actually a firecracker or some sort of explosive device, because guns don't normally leave a lot of smoke, but firecrackers do. And I read so I started looking through, military publications from the World War II and stuff. And sure enough, both the Germans and the Japanese in World War II were using firecrackers. Their snipers were using them to divert so that people on the ground wouldn't know where their location was. So I thought that was interesting. And of course, if there was a shooter in the 6th floor depository, I mean, the school book depository, the 6th floor of the school book depository, it would make sense that there would be someone, if it was a conspiracy, that someone would diversion to lead them away from that. So I'm like, okay, well, that actually does make sense. And then, so I think that there was more than, I think it was a conspiracy. I also think that the shooter on the 6th floor, I don't believe was Oswald. Now, some people will say, oh, so you think Oswald's just a patsy? I tend to believe Oswald probably did shoot Tippit while he was on the run. But it wasn't by that he was involved in something. Maybe he was told that, oh, we're going to fake shoot at Kennedy, or maybe we're going to pretend to shoot at Kennedy, or maybe he was told him we're going to hang a banner out the window that said, Kennedy is a commie or something like that. Maybe it was
Mhm.
something like that. So there could have been something afoot that Oswald was involved in. He realized it spiraled out of control. He was on the run. He went back to his room. He got a gun, and then this cop is stopping him, and he thinks the cop might be there to kill him. He doesn't know, so he shoots the cop. Now, a lot of people are like, "Oh my God!" And then I have a lot of friends who are 100% convinced that the whole Tippit shooting was a fake, or that somebody else killed Tippit, and they just pretended like it was Oswald. And I haven't been able to go down that road. I do, and one of the things that was at Scoggins, I don't spend a lot of time on the Tippit case on my website because
Mhm.
I haven't done a lot of research on it, and two, I've been focusing on other elements. But the I think it was the taxi driver who said that as the character he thought was Oswald walked by, he muttered, "Poor dumb cop."
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I don't picture a paid assassin saying that. I picture Lee Harvey Oswald saying that when he shot the guy while fleeing for his life.
On the Tippit case, have you read Del Meyer's book?
I have not read. You know what? I have read parts of it. I have read parts of it.
Okay. Okay.
His book is extremely expensive. I mean, most books you can eventually find for like $10 or something,
Mhm.
and his book is what, 60, $70 or something
Oh,
like
okay.
that. Yeah, it's very expensive. But I think someone had a digitized copy of it that they shared with me at one point, and I did look through it.
Mhm.
And I think Dale Myers did some valid research on that case. I don't know if his conclusions are all accurate. I'm not going to vouch for them, but I think Dale Myers is he can be a dogged researcher when he wants to be, but I think
Mhm.
he's somebody who's like, he can't go down every road because he knows that in his mind, the roads have to end at Oswald being a killer and
Mhm.
everything being Lee Harvey Oswald. Because I mean, I've seen interviews with him and stuff where he said things like, basically that to say that it wasn't Oswald is to hate America. And I'm just like, I love America, and I fully believe that Oswald probably didn't do it. I mean, my love for America is not based upon the fact that we've never done anything wrong, and it's not based on the fact that some bad people, couldn't conspire
Mhm.
to kill a president. That could certainly happen. We People conspire to kill Lincoln. Did that make America a terrible place? I mean, every country's had some conspiracies and stuff, and France has had its share of tragedies and conspiracies.
Well, I wrote a piece on the Dreyfus case, trying to give arguments to show that it differs a great deal from the Kennedy assassination. When I uploaded it on the Education Forum a few weeks ago.
I did read
Uh,
it. I read it. Yeah.
mhm. Well, but that's another story. But it is interesting. It is interesting because that's what well, a few years ago, it was, well, maybe 10 years ago when I went to Dallas. Well, no, not 10 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. I went to Dallas for one of the JFK Lancer conferences, and I was lucky enough to meet, what's his name again? Jim Mars.
Oh, Jim Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a taped interview of Jim Mars, and it was interesting. And we talked about the Dreyfus case, and but it was interesting. Well, he's not among us anymore. I wanted to go back to that. I said in the introduction that you are an expert on the medical area, the medical domain of the area of the Kennedy assassination. What does that teach you as far as the wounds are concerned? Because there were so many controversies about the wounds locations, you know that. And what does it tell you about the number of shots and the location of the shooters?
Um, I don't even know what an expert on the Kennedy assassination and medical evidence would look like because the people that I've met
Mhm.
who are supposedly experts almost all have like a blind spot, or they just don't know what they're talking about quite often. I'm somebody who grew up in a medical family. My mom was a nurse, so there was medical books in
Okay.
the house, and I wasn't intimidated by that kind of stuff. So I at a certain point, I said, like, I should just go to a medical library and start researching some of this stuff to see if this is what gunshot wounds really look like, or see if this guy, and I went to UCLA Biomed Library, and I believe that's where David Lifton did a lot of his research. So I was just like, I almost felt like I was walking in his footsteps or something like that. I could feel his spirit because there's all these like, have you ever been in the stacks of a library? It's like, 10 feet tall of books, and it's like only like 3 feet across, and you're just like surrounded by books and all this knowledge. And sometimes you're the only person on the floor, and you're just like all this information. And then I have to, oh, there it is. There's that one book, and then you get it and you read and you're like, holy crap, And so I spent several years photocopying. I spent hundreds of dollars on photocopies, and then I would, because you can't take the books home from the research library. And anyhow, so I took all these articles home, and I spent about a month reading like 20 articles and digesting them. Then I go back for more, and I got interested in all sorts of aspects of the case, mostly the medical, and but I also researched a little bit on the testing, the bullet testing, the comparative bullet lead testing that was done on a bullet that they believed was the bullet that went through Kennedy, and then maybe Connolly as well, or anyhow, the magic bullet. Then I also did a lot of research on eyewitness evidence and cognitive psychology, because one of the arguments a lot of people make is that you cannot be a bunch of people see something and therefore they're all right. People said that the wound was on the very far back of the head, therefore they must be all right. And one, I think you've probably done this as well. You go through those statements and they're not all saying the same thing. People say the same thing. No, they do not. And then the other thing is that people do make mistakes, and sometimes in a uniform way. The human mind is not, we're not recording devices. We have, everything gets sifted through impressions, and our impressions can change based upon what somebody says to us afterwards. Like, did you see that guy in the green shirt? And the guy had a blue shirt, and you knew he had a blue shirt. And the next thing you know, you're like, yeah, I think it was a green shirt because somebody said it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens every day. Anyhow, so about the medical evidence, let's go back to that, because I know that's what you're interested in. So one of the things I found was that Kennedy's head wound, which you see in the Zapruder film and which you see in the autopsy photos, is a gigantic gaping hole, right? I found that that kind of ammunition fired at that range would not leave a hole that big. It doesn't, that's not the expected outcome. And so I would look, well, what would cause it to be like that? And eventually I realized that if a bullet hits at a short angle, let's say here you're going through what, an eighth of an inch or a quarter inch of bone. But here, if you hit at an angle, you have to go through all, this bone, and the bullet will break up and it will explode the head. So it's called a tangential wound. So I did a lot of research on tangential wounds. I found all sorts of military publications. I even found some pictures and some research. It's not a very common wound, so there's not that much material on it. But I did find enough material to convince me that Kennedy's large head wound, the one you see in the Zapruder film, was a bullet that impacted at that location. It did not enter low on the back of the head. It did not enter high in the back of the head. It entered where you see the explosion at. And that's what a number of witnesses, including William Newman, he was only like 15 feet, actually he's probably 25 feet away. But William Newman was a guy on the sidewalk with his wife and 2 kids. He's still alive. And he's there and he's watching Kennedy go by, and then boom, he sees Kennedy's head explode. And for years he would tell people, I think his ear blew off his head. Well, it's because there's, in the Zapruder film, you can see a big skull fragment blast forward. You see something hanging from the side of the head, you would, in a second, you probably think it was the ear, So anyhow, so I'm convinced that the bullet impacted there. So the other question is, well, what about the bullet that the doctor said was low on a bullet hole? The doctor said they found low on the back of the head. Well, that's one of the things which is still perplexing to me, because I see the so-called mystery photo, the one that's showing with the brain removed. The initial report that the doctors wrote, which was a couple years after, but they did go back and look at the autopsy photos and say, what were we looking at here? And they said, oh, it's a photo of the back of the head showing the bullet entrance. Well, I look at that photo and I say, yeah, it's the back of the head and there's a bullet entrance. But then it disappears. There's no record after that initial report of the doctors in 1966 ever saying that there's a bullet hole in my picture. In fact, they'll go on and on like, well, there's no bullet hole here, and I'm like, what? So I actually have it on my website. I have like a just cut out that little picture of a bullet hole. Say, what is this? It's not a bullet hole. Why? And it's and the reason is the 1968, as you know, the because there was so much controversy about the medical evidence, the government had formed a secret panel of some doctors that was basically like randomly selected, but when you look, they all knew each other. They were all friends. So I don't think it was. I think that's nonsense that they were randomly selected. Anyhow, they all get together, and four of them, and they discuss the medical evidence, and they were shown some of the photos. For whatever reason, the Clark panel, the Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, who was working for Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson, of course, has already associated himself with the idea that Oswald did it. He felt his whole administration would be under threat if people thought it was a conspiracy, because then people might blame him. So he wanted, there was certainly a pressure to say that it was fine and Oswald did it. Well, they said they took a look at the evidence, and they said they changed a couple of things. They first said that the bullet that the autopsy doctors had said entered low in the head and exploded at the top of the head. They said, well, that trajectory doesn't work because it's coming from 6 floors up, hits here and comes out here. No one really must have entered here, where no one at the autopsy saw an entrance. So it's like, what? Nobody saw an entrance there, and they picked out a spot which Dr. Humes from the autopsy, when he was first shown it, he said that's just a speck of blood, and they said, well, that's the bullet hole, and then and then years later when I was gonna say a different panel confirmed their findings that was the entrance up higher, and the doctor in charge of that was Dr. Michael Baden. And he was friends with the guys who'd already said it was up there, and so he was going to confirm what they had to say. But there's actually notes found in the archives by, I think Randy Robertson was the first guy to find them. Anyhow, where he's writing to the woman who did it, because they didn't show the photos, but they did drawings of the photos, tracings. He keeps sending it back to her saying, no, you need to make that spot look like a bullet hole. And he sends her a picture of what an actual bullet hole is like. He says, make it look more like this. Right. So so they moved the entrance wound up to the top of the head. And the other main thing they did is that photo, which was supposedly of the back of the head showing the bullet hole, they said, oh no, that's the forehead. So they switched around and said, oh, that bone in it is not this part of the bone, it's this part of the bone. And so that's that's my video series where I go through and show, because there's a drainage hole on the autopsy table in the background, and I show how you can use other things to show what angle the photo was taken from, and therefore you can conclude that it's not the forehead. It doesn't make any sense if it's the forehead. It's just nonsense. Anyhow, so I conclude that the giant wound is a tangential wound of entrance and exit. This wound, the lower wound that the doctors really saw lower on the back of the head, is a separate wound. Because one of the reasons why the Clark panel in 1968 said that that the wound had to be higher is because they found no evidence of a trajectory from low to high within the brain. So it's like, well, it must have been higher then, because there's no trajectory from low to yeah. Trigger. So a line of air. Tissue, I think is the term they use there. It's interstitial emphysema. Anyhow, they show a line in the neck coming, above because there's a throat wound, right? And so I think maybe the bullet that entered low on the back of the head went down the neck and came out the throat. And now I thought that's weird. And I'm like, does that ever happen? And strangely enough, I found out that the HSCA, which reinvestigated this in the 70s, so they reinvestigated it jointly with the assassination of Martin Luther King, And Martin Luther King was shot in the face, and the bullet went down his neck and exited his back. So it does happen where a bullet enters the head and goes goes down the neck, because it happened in Martin Luther King. Anyhow, so I concluded that that's probably what happened with the bullet entering low on the back of the head. So that leaves the back wound, which the doctor said entered the back, exited the throat.
Mm-hmm.
They admitted that during the autopsy, they tried to probe it and they couldn't find it. Didn't even go below the first layer of skin. And I'm like, well, that's weird. And then unfortunately, they didn't dissect it because they were told not to, because people thought, oh, we know he was killed by that shot to the head. We don't need to worry about this other stuff. So the doctors were told not to dissect the neck. So they didn't even figure out if the bullet came down the neck or went through from the back. But the evidence suggests to me that whatever hit the back, probably a dud bullet, or because snipers will sometimes have bullets that are like designed to subsonic, right? They're not fired at the same velocity as a normal bullet, because they don't want people to hear it. Because a lot of what people hear is the explosion of the gun, but they also hear the crack of the bullet going through there. If it's going supersonic, if it's going 1,000 feet per second. So anyhow, so I was like, okay, all this leads me to believe that these people, the assassins, that it was a team of assassins, because they knew how to divert people, and they knew how, and they were using subsonic ammunition. So it wasn't Oswald acting alone. It was a team of assassins. And now some people say, oh, it must have been the CIA. And I found that the CIA did have books. They have a guide that they handed out in Guatemala, telling them to use 22 caliber ammunition fired subsonically was a good way to assassinate somebody, particularly if you assassinate them in public, because then you can use it for propaganda purposes. You can get away and like disrupt things. And I'm like, okay, so it sounds like whoever killed Kennedy, which I've interpreted now as a team, that they had, CIA training or similar type training to what the CIA was training people. But do I think the CIA sat around and had a meeting and said, John McCone and Richard Helms, we got to kill Kennedy? I do not believe that. I think that's nonsense. So the conspiracy theory that attracts me, that seems to make the most sense to me, involved with a few people who really hated JFK, considered it probably considered him a traitor, or certainly not a patriot. And you see that element within the anti-Castro Cuban groups, and also with the CIA agents who worked with them. So if somehow we have, got concrete evidence, right now there is circumstantial evidence, but if someone like David Sanchez Morales, Rip Robertson, these were CIA agents who worked with the Cubans, who are purported to have hated Kennedy. And then there are a number of these, anti-Castro Cubans that have been involved. And supposedly, Larry Hancock wrote a book called Someone Would Have Talked, which he took a lot of comments that were made and statements that were made by largely the anti-Castro Cuban community, but also the mafia. So the mafia was working with the anti-Castro Cubans supposedly to kill Kennedy. I mean, supposedly to kill Castro, but the possibility exists that the CIA agents working with the mafia and the Cubans, who were going to be the shooters, turned it around and just decided to kill Kennedy instead. So,
okay, very interesting. If I understand you well, according to what you've just told me, and correct me if I'm wrong, you don't believe in the single bullet theory, the magic bullet theory, or I would say the single bullet theory. You don't believe in that, do you?
I do not.
Okay.
And in fact, so the 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And so there was a lot of conferences for that. But then they wanted to have another conference for the 50th anniversary of the Warren Report, which was the book the book and its 26 volumes that came out a few months later, that supposedly explained everything and convinced the American people that Oswald acted alone. So they had that in Bethesda, Maryland. And a lot of prominent people are going to be there. Prominent, but I mean, not just research world people, but also like people from the Warren Commission, people from, historical societies. Uh, Oswald's friend from Russia, Ernest Tikovitz, he flew in to go to that conference. So I got to go to this conference, and I'm like, well, what should I'd like to speak there. And I saw no one was speaking about the single bullet theory because it's kind of like old hat. Like none of the top researchers in the JFK research community on the conspiracy side of the fence anyhow believe in the single bullet theory, and they kind of ignore it, not realizing that there's been so many TV shows and things pushing the single bullet theory that good probably 30% of the American population does believe it. So, and a lot of the people like a lot of educated people, a lot of people who read Bugliosi's book or Posner's book, people who think of themselves as being intelligent and they subscribe to the single bullet theory. So I'm like, okay, I want to do that. I'll do that. No one else seems interested in doing that. I'm going to do the single bullet theory. So I started researching it beyond the normal level, and I found some stuff that was like drop my jaw, And one of them was that so the autopsy drawing has the bullet on the back and the entrance on the back and the exit on the throat, which once again makes no sense if the shot was fired from 6 floors up, right? And then but then the doctors, when they testified, presented a drawing which shows the bullet entering at the base of the neck, roughly 2 inches higher than where it is or maybe 3 inches higher than it is in the other one. Anyhow, and their measurements at autopsy were that the bullet was at the level of the shoulder tip, right? But all of a sudden, in their drawing that they gave the Warren Commission, it's up here, at the base of the neck. So what's going on here? Why does this happen? And so I looked through all the notes. I looked at these before, but our inspector, who was an attorney for the Warren Commission, he went out and he interviewed them, and he told them, like, hey, we can't enter the photographs in your testimony, but maybe you could bring some drawings along. And I'm like, okay, so the doctors. Now, I thought prior to doing this deep dive that, okay, so the doctors are kind of like, well, we need to make things add up. But while doing this deep dive, I realized that when our inspector went to speak to them, to the doctors, and get them to create these drawings, that he wasn't alone. He was with Joseph Ball. And Joseph Ball was not part of the team with Spector that was supposed to be investigating the medical evidence. He was somebody whose job, he and David Bellin, their job was to find the evidence showing Oswald to be the shooter up in the 6th floor. So they interviewed a lot of the co-workers and stuff like that to try to put that evidence together. But I found a memo written by him, which had been put online by Howard Willens, who'd worked for the Warren Commission and was convinced that like they were all on and up, everything was on the up and up, and that there was nothing sneaky about what they did at all. He was convinced. So to his credit, he made a lot of this stuff available. So he had some of the internal papers from the Warren Commission, which hadn't been widely read, and I've read some of them. And one of them was a memo from Joseph Ball and his partner, David Bellin, saying that they were assuming the responsibility of explaining how a shot from the 6th floor could enter here and exit here. Okay, so he's taken that as his personal responsibility to explain this. And he goes with Spector out to meet the doctors, right? And now the doctors present a drawing in which the bullet wound is now inches higher than it was on the original drawing. So, put 2 and 2 together, he convinced them to do that. I mean, it just seems obvious to me. And, there's a lot of other evidence involving the way Ball and Bellin treated the witnesses, where they would try to get them to testify in a certain way. They weren't just there to like write, report, to ask questions and have people say what happened. They were pushing the evidence in a certain direction. Like Bill Frazier was somebody who said that that Oswald had carried a bag to work in that morning, but he remembered the bag as being small, not big enough to, too small to have held the rifle that Oswald supposedly brought into the building. Well, according to Frazier, Ball kept like saying, "How big was it again? How big was it again?" Trying to get him to change his story about how big the bag was. And you see a lot of that with Ball and Bell. These two guys knew that if they just presented everything straight, there'd be a lot of questions. And Earl Warren, and this is also in the memos that were presented by Howard Willens. Willens had a diary, and he also had memos saying that Warren had let it be known that he wanted to have a clean record. He wanted the record to be clean, and to achieve the clean record, it was okay for them to pre-interview witnesses. And the obvious implication is that they would not ask questions they thought were going to be problematic. So they'd say, like, did you see another shooter? And then somebody would say, yeah, I saw another shooter. So then they'd like, okay, now we're going to go on the record. Do you remember going to work that day or whatever? They'd ask different questions based upon, what was said to begin with. And so the Warren Commission, I grew up in a time in the United States. I don't know if you did this in France, probably not. But I grew up in a time where we were told that any day the Russians could just drop a bomb on us. Any day. We had a regular routine drop drills in school where we got under the tables because in case a nuclear bomb went off. Like we got under the tables in case a nuclear bomb went off. So we'd be protected, see? And we did this once a week. I think it was every Friday. And then I think it was once a month, he'd set the alarms off in the school where we'd all, the alarms would go off. We'd have to practice like going out in case we had to be evacuated or whatever. We were lived in constant fear of this stuff. And that's the mentality I think that was going on in 1963. And people were like, okay, well, we got to support the government here. We can't let people think that there's Oswald, this communist, that he was working for Russia. We can't. So I think that was part of what was going on with these guys trying to shove it all into this commie kid, the lone nut, Lee Harvey Oswald. I think some of them were trying to shove it into that box because they were afraid what would happen if they didn't, And so I don't think that they were knowingly covering up for the murderers as much as they were trying to protect the country. But I do think there was a deliberate effort on the part of a number of people working for the Warren Commission to make it an Oswald did it conclusion, to push the Oswald did it conclusion on the American public.
Okay, very interesting again. I have several other questions, but that is very interesting, and I'm happy that I'm recording that. I suppose on a personal level, I suppose you have met David Lifton, haven't you?
Yes, I met David.
Have you had like personal time together so you could have a debate or a discussion, a conversation, the two of you?
Well, he was a member of the same online forum, so periodically he'd say, like, you don't know what you're talking about. And he was one of the few people when he'd say something like that, I would be grateful because he was actually very articulate, and he would say, I met so-and-so, and he had his facts. He'd have it lined up. He evidently on his computer, he had, a lot of, I don't know if it was his book, but he'd have different like things he'd written over the years, and which he could refer to. And so he could tell you like, oh, I first met Harold Weisberg in, November 1966 or whatever. And he'd have this information. So I was of a divided mind when it came to David Lifton, because sometimes people would say like, this guy's a bully and I don't like him. And they would try to there'd be an effort to try to get him kicked off this forum he was writing on. But I thought, no, he's a useful resource. I want to know what it was like to sit in a room with Harold Weisberg and Mark Lane or whatever. I wanted to know what it was like in those early days. And, Lifton not only met them, but he also he met Alan Dulles at a conference, and I think he had an argument with Alan Dulles at a conference and stuff like that. I found that really fascinating. So I was really intrigued by the guy, and I was glad to know him. But he was also somebody who was kind of a sad person in that he wrote a bestseller. He got his ideas, whether you believe it or not. He believed the body had been altered, and he put together this massive book which tells the story of how he comes to believe this, which is actually good because it tells you each step of why he comes to get there. And you can choose to go down a different road, but at least you were getting evidence that wasn't, most of it was not available at the time. A lot of the reports and stuff he talks about, people did not know about. So Best Evidence, I think, is a good book, even though I disagree with its conclusions. But he kind of liked that attention, or he liked that feeling that he was on the cutting edge. And so then he's like, well, I'm working on a second book. And as you know, he never put it out. 40 years. 40 years. And I think he was living in an apartment by himself. And, he never had a family. And, and so a couple of times he called me up and say like, oh, there's going to be this movie. You want to go meet me? And I'd meet him, and we'd sit down next to each other and watch this movie together, and then we'd talk about it afterwards or whatever. And one time we went to a restaurant afterwards, and there was like this clique of people that were like, oh, that's David Lifton, because they went to the same movie. It was a screening of, I can't remember what's his name. Anyhow, it was a screening of a conspiracy documentary. And so afterwards, a lot of people went to the same restaurant, and they all wanted to sit around Lifton and chat with him. So I'm like, okay, well, he calls me on the phone sometimes, and we chat on the phone. So I'll let them have their time with the great David Lifton. But towards the end, I started to worry about him because he called me one time. He called me late at night, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm not going to pick this up. It's like 12:30 or something. So I called him like 2 days later and said, oh yeah, what did you call me? He says, I didn't call you. I said, you started to leave a message and then you stopped halfway through the message. He says, no, I didn't. I'm like, okay. So he's getting older, maybe, or I don't know. I don't think he drank, but maybe that was a factor. Now someone's going to start a forum. Pat Speer says David Lifton is alcoholic. No, I never saw the guy drink. I don't. Okay. So then, but then the last time I talked to him, we exchanged some messages on the education forum after that. But the last time I talked to him, he wanted to run an idea by me, and it went on for about over an hour, I think. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was pretty much that. I was saying like, okay, because he was telling me about how he was convinced about. Someone pointed out, at the time he pointed out a few statements, a few memos which supported this, but they were not credible things that you really need to rely upon. I thought, anyhow. But his theory, his latest theory that he was working on at the end was that the original plot of they was that Kennedy was going to be, his body was going to be altered, not on the plane, not at Bethesda, en route to the hospital, in an ambulance. This was what he was saying towards the end of his life, in that the limo was supposed to stop, and they were supposed to throw his body into this ambulance, and then doctors were going to change his wounds in the ambulance. I was like, it's just so convoluted, David. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then he's like, oh, but I got all the evidence for it. He makes it sound like he's got all this concrete evidence that he just has like one person saying that I thought I saw an ambulance, or I can't even remember what his evidence was. But he says, Connolly wasn't supposed to get shot. So when Connolly got shot, they realized that they couldn't stop and throw JFK in an ambulance, that they needed to just race to Parkland Hospital. Okay, so he is thinking about some of this stuff, and why they did this, why they did that. But the whole idea of this initial plot didn't make any sense to me. And then he lost me totally. And I actually was just, at that point, I just kind of didn't say anything. I just kind of nodded my head. He said that, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was William Kent Clark, the doctor who pronounced Kennedy dead, and who described seeing cerebellum, and is kind of one of the main people that Lifton uses to develop his whole theory that Kennedy was shot from the front. He said that Clark was late getting to the hospital because he was one of the guys who was in the ambulance waiting to change Kennedy's wounds. And I think he said Jenkins was, I think there was a third. I think he might have said there was three. Anyhow, I think there was three doctors, he said, that ended up working on Kennedy, trying to save his life, that were actually supposed to change his wounds before he even got to the hospital. And that, I'm actually feeling a little bit tear. I want to cry thinking about that, because Lifton spent so much energy trying to perfect his theory. And they always say don't get high on your own supply or whatever. Like, he just wanted that constant excitement of finding something new, finding something. That's what I would say. Maybe I'm wrong, but it felt like he just wanted to be titillated in a new way, to titillate people in a new way. And it just got weirder and weirder. And, I get attacked all the time because I think that's a lot of the Parkland doctors. I think they were wrong when they said they thought they saw cerebellum. Cerebellum's low in the back of the head. I think the wound was more higher, and so it turns out that if the brain gets scrambled, that some people will mistake macerated, is the fancy word for it, macerated cerebrum, which is up the top part of the brain. If it gets scrambled, some people might confuse it with cerebellum, right? And the doctors, several of them, said that themselves later on, but people like David Lifton and a number of other researchers, they were just lying. They were just saying that because they were afraid. And you, fortunately, I'm grateful to that, you contacted them and got them to put in writing what they thought of Lifton's theory, and they were just like, no, bullshit. They called bullshit on it, right? Every one of them, right? Did any of them say they thought there was anything to it?
There were only like, I could even send you all the documents that I have, copies of them, because it's always interesting. And I sent them to David Lifton, by the way, a few years ago. And there were a few. One of them was Dr. Perry. That was interesting. I will send it to you. And a few of them were, there were not lots of them, maybe 3 or 4. That's all, from Parkland. Only 4.
You shared some of them with me years ago.
Oh, I did? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. But that was interesting, especially Perry, of course. And there was another one, Carrico, maybe? It could have been him.
Carrico, yeah. Baxter.
Baxter too. I'm not sure about Baxter. Yeah. I think Carrico. I would have to check my own notes, because I don't remember. I don't recall. And I scanned them a few years ago, and I uploaded them, but not anymore. So I should do that. And I will check. Because that was interesting. And yes, they did. One of them, I don't remember who. One of them did write that he considered Posner as the guy who had it right. I remember that he wrote that.
Oh yeah.
And and as to Dr. Perry, that was interesting. That's why I sent it to David Lifton a few years ago, because Dr. Perry was adamant, well, at least in the letter that he wrote to me, that it could have been either an entrance or an exit wound. He said it could have been either one. So he wasn't saying it was an entrance wound, an exit wound, the throat wound. He said it could have been either. So you can't use it as someone, or you can't use it to prove a point saying that it was an entrance wound, because it doesn't.
Yeah, about that wound. He did say, when he originally did in the press conference, he did describe it. He said it looked like an entrance wound, and I think that then he said it was an entrance wound. But the reality is that emergency room doctors are not taught to come to conclusions, right? They try to save the life, and then they say what they saw. So Perry, throughout his life, would always say it looked like an entrance wound, but that doesn't mean it was an entrance wound. And even McClelland, who got became the darling of the conspiracy research community, he said in his Warren Commission testimony, which I find interesting, he said that it looked like an entrance wound, but it could have been an exit for a slowly moving missile, I think is what he said. So I'm like, so to me, that's a clue. You follow up on these things like that. So that's why I think maybe it could have been the exit for a bullet or a fragment from the head wound. And Josiah Thompson, someone who I have an enormous respect for, he in 6 Seconds in Dallas, he believed that the throat wound was caused by a bone fragment that went down the neck, right? And he cites all these, the Parkland doctors. A number of them said things about the neck beyond just that there was a hole there. They would say that it was deviated to the side, there was swelling, there was bruising, that something, things indicating that the bullet had come down the neck. So there is a lot of evidence. But yeah, people say, oh, this doctor said that, and that emergency room doctors don't work like that. I've aged dramatically over the last, decade, but particularly in the last couple of years because I've been fighting cancer. I went into a hospital and I spent a month there, and you lose all your hair, and you're in pure hell. And lost 50 pounds in a couple of months. And so I spent a lot of time with doctors, right? And a lot of time and doctors they're kind of like cautious. They don't want to really come to conclusions. They want to defer to other experts. That's kind of their nature. They're not really taught to be like really opinionated, but once they make their opinion, they're kind of like, well, that's it. They don't want to be second guessed or whatever. So doctors are not trained to look at it and say, that's an entrance wound, that's an exit wound. Forensic pathologists are trained to do that. So that's one of the interesting things, is that so many people are desperate to place the findings of the autopsy, the Parkland doctors, over the autopsy doctors, when the Parkland doctors themselves defer to the autopsy doctors. They know that it's not their place. They didn't even take notes during their treatment of Kennedy. It's not their role to say it's an entrance wound or an exit wound. They can just say what they thought they saw. And so when it comes to the throat wound, it is misleading that people will say, well, they said it was an entrance wound. It doesn't mean it was an entrance wound, but the small size of it is interesting and can lead to other conclusions. But it's not because they said it was an entrance wound, it's because they said it was small.
That's right. Okay, very reasonable, very interesting, fascinating, I should say. Now, you said you didn't reach the conclusions reached by David Lifton in his book, Best Evidence. Does that mean, if I understand you well, let me get this straight, you do not think that the body was altered in any way, anywhere?
I do not believe the body was altered. I believe that the Zapruder film, the autopsy photos, the autopsy x-rays, and the autopsy report are all clear evidence for more than two headshots, and are more than clear evidence for a conspiracy. And if people would just focus on that and go spend a couple of years of their life at the UCLA Biomed Library, they would know that as well. Now, I tried to share a lot of that information online, but a lot of people are hesitant to read. They want to read like 2 paragraphs, or they want to see someone on TV go like, it was an entrance wound. They don't want to really think, or in some ways they get excited. I think you and I could share our disdain for like people who think that Hickey did it. There's a lot of people who saw a TV show which said that one of the Secret Service agents accidentally shot Kennedy, and that explains everything. And that's it. That solved it. They've just totally embraced that. And to me, it's just like, no, please say no. Or at one point, fortunately, this has died down. There were a lot of people who would argue with you that James Files, this mafia figure, James Files, what was he, 17 or 18 years old at the time? And they're going to trust an 18-year-old kid to go be the assassin on the knoll who blows the president's head off. I don't know. But people get excited sometimes about something because and I think sometimes filmmakers, rather than be boring and show me chatting and trying to explain stuff, it's more exciting to them to have some, I'll use the word crazy, wild theory. Okay, let's back off from crazy just to say a wild theory, and get people to go, maybe. That, to them as a filmmaker, that's more interesting than actually educating people on the facts. And that is so discouraging. Like, I didn't listen to it yet. People tell me I need to listen to it. Have told me I need to listen to it. But Rob Reiner, actor, director, he's prominent here in America. He did his podcast, a few months back, which ended up, saying who he thought were the shooters were and all this. But I was discouraged from the beginning when it was like, oh, some of the exciting information, it was that, oh, the shots actually came from the south knoll, not the grassy knoll to the north, the south knoll. And that's why, and I'm like, okay, I'm familiar with that argument. And I was friends with Sherry Feaster, who was one of the people who developed that argument. But it doesn't really hold a lot of water when you really look at the evidence in detail that there was a shooter down there. And I think that Rob Reiner just grasped at that because he wanted something new and exciting to have in his podcast. I don't know. And so let me ask you. I know you started out being like following Lifton and kind of thinking there was something there. And then you realized a lot of that was nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where are you today? Are you on the fence? Or are you a lone nutter who's willing to believe that there is more to it?
I confess, I am a lone nutter. I am a lone nutter. I truly believe, because David Lifton was my hero. He was really my hero at the time. I mean, when I read Best Evidence when I was young, and I thought he had found the solution, the explanation to everything. I thought he was a hero. And what was interesting is I had a conversation with Dr. Wecht in Pittsburgh. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Wecht in his office in Pittsburgh, and I thought he would concur with Lifton. Obviously, Lifton has found the solution, so obviously everybody will agree with him. And I met Dr. Wecht, and he said, no, Lifton is wrong. Wow. First shock. And then I went to Dallas and I met Robert Groden, and he said, no, Lifton is wrong. And I couldn't understand that. So that was the beginning of my, not doubts, but I just didn't understand. But Lifton was my hero at the time. But then I read and I kept on, reading books, talking to people, debating, and checking. And little by little, over the years, I became convinced that I had been wrong at the beginning of my research. I had been wrong. So I said, no, I was wrong. The truth is, Oswald did it. And the more I learned about it, the more I was convinced that Oswald was the sole assassin, the lone assassin. And now I'm on the side of the lone nutters. I'm David von Peen or David von Pine. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm on his side.
On Payne, because it's
Von Payne? Because as you said yourself, there are still questions that we don't really have answers for. But I will tell you, I believe deep down that the official version is right. And I wrote a book saying that. So I believe Oswald did it. But I understand that some people would doubt that. I do understand that. It's a book, and in my book, I criticize Lifton's theory. So it was like the son killing his father, in a way, you understand, because he was my hero, but I still, to this day, I miss him. I do. I miss him, really. And I wish I had been able to meet him, talk to him, things like that. But he had a big influence on me as an intellectual guy who wrote a book, and he was very bright, he was intelligent, he was a hard worker. But I concur everything you said about him. I agree. 100%. I agree with you with that. But he was an influence, a big influence, maybe the biggest influence I ever had in my entire life. Now, that's fine. I want to ask you a few other questions, please. You talked about wild theories. I would love to have your opinion on 3 of what I call wild theories. What do you think? Was the Zapruder film altered or not? That's my first question. What's your take on that? What do you think of Prayer Man? And what I call really a wild theory, some researchers say that the second floor encounter never took place. What do you say?
Okay, you're trying to get some eggs thrown at me from that. No, I think the Zapruder film strong evidence for a conspiracy, and that's one of the reasons why they didn't want to show it, because one, it's shocking, and two, like I said, a lot of people would have to know that a bullet to the head does not look, the head doesn't explode in that way, just like a normal military bullet. A lot of, in the 1960s, a lot of guys had been in Vietnam, World War II, Korea, and then, by the end of the 60s, a lot of people had been in Vietnam. And these guys know that that's not what happens. It's a bullet doesn't just go boom, and then leave a tiny hole in the back and a gigantic explosion. That can happen, particularly with a smaller and faster fired ammunition. But the older World War II era ammunition, that's not what happened. The skulls did not explode in that manner. Anyhow, so I think it's strong evidence for multiple headshots, and I think that, let me see. Oh, about the Zapruder being fake. So I don't really buy that. And when it's one of those things where you look and somebody will say, "Well, we know it was fake because it was taken to the original film was taken to the CIA's film alteration lab." And you look and it's like, okay, so what's the evidence that the original film was taken there? There is none. There is none. The original film, there's no evidence that the original film was taken there. It just doesn't exist. But they assume it was taken there because a film ended up at was it NPIC, National Photo Interpretation Center. That was officially one of the copy films, right? One of the copies that were made. And these guys analyzed it. And then 30 years later or whatever, these guys are actually originally was the 70s. The one guy's recollections were kind of, the people who worked there, their recollections are kind of a little bit different. Like they don't remember it exactly the way it looks and stuff like that. And so some people, namely mostly Doug Horn, I think, pieced it together, what these guys said, to make it look like, oh, the film was taken and it was altered and it was brought back to them. And the one guy saw the one version of the film, another guy saw another version of the film. But then if you look at the actual statements, the one guy's like, yeah, I don't remember if I saw it on Saturday or Sunday. They're just vague statements that he's cherry picked what he wants, what he needs to have his theory that it was altered. And then I haven't seen it yet, but someone told me that there was a French documentary recently where Dino Brigioni, one of the guys whose statements have been used to suggest that the film was faked or was altered, that he says he doesn't think it was altered. I haven't seen this footage. I don't know if you've seen it, but
I haven't.
It wouldn't surprise me at all because I know from MOs and online and arguments with conspiracy theorists and single assassin theorists that most people don't want to look at all the evidence and then say, well, this is probably what happened. They want to take one statement and say, well, this is what happened. They want to have that certainty within themselves, and they want to project that certainty to others, right? So you want to say, like Robert Groden, who I've met, and I like Bob. He's a nice guy. When I met him, he actually asked for my autograph, which was a very complimentary thing, because he knows that he's a prominent researcher. I'm sort of a nobody at that time, anyhow, and he wanted my autograph. I thought that was a very nice gesture. Maybe he was going to turn around and sell it on eBay. I don't know, but he wanted my autograph because my friend Brad that I did these videos with, he put out the DVD that you could buy the videos if you wanted to, even though they're free on YouTube. You could buy them if you wanted to have them for your collection. So Groden had one, and he wanted me to sign it, and I was like, okay. And he let me sit at the table with him and talk to people on the grassy knoll and answering questions and stuff. I like Robert Groden, but he's somebody who doesn't want to live in the gray zone. He wants to believe, he wants things to be certain. So he got up at the one of the conferences and he said that every witness to describe the wound to him, I think he said it was over 80 witnesses, all said the back of the head was blown out. And that's just not true. And at the time, all these heads turned to me like they thought I would be the one to know. They're like, is that true? Is that true? And I'm like, no. And then it was fellow conspiracy theorists as well as I think John McAdams and a few other people, a few other lone nutters asked me, "Is that true?" And I'm like, "No, it's not true." And he wants that certainty, so he's going to say that. And you couldn't get all the witnesses to agree on what I don't know who the first president was or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you just look and there's just so many disagreements among the witnesses in their witness statements, and a lot of times within the statements of the witnesses themselves. They'll say, they'll be interviewed 1 year, they'll say one thing, and they'll be interviewed a year later, they'll say something different. And I don't think they're lying. I just think that's the way human memory works. A lot of times, you'll get influenced, and sometimes you just misspeak. Like the other day, I did an interview, and then I listened to it afterwards, and I was talking about the guys on the railroad bridge who saw smoke, who thought they saw smoke from the grassy knoll, and I kept saying they were the radio men. Railroad, radio, not the same thing, but I kept saying the wrong word. And so, anyhow, I forget how I got this topic, but I was talking about how people get so entranced by their theories that they just their mind starts to align everything to support their theory, and they can't see the big picture. And I'm wondering if, like I said before, I'm not the smartest guy or whatever, but I think it might be my talent is that I am able to take a step back and kind of see the big picture better than most people, anyhow.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I love that. I love you are smart. You said I'm saying you are very smart, and I love it. What about the two other wild theories I asked you about?
Oh, I forgot about that because I was so involved in my own discussion. Okay, so you also mentioned Prayer Man. Okay, I was there at the beginning of Prayer Man. Sean Murphy, I think was his name. There's also a baseball player named Sean Murphy, I think, now that I think about it. Anyhow, Sean, he presented, this theory on the education forum, like, hey, what about this? And I'm like, that's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that guy back there. But then everybody started saying, well, it looks exactly like Oswald. And I'm like, does it? I don't know. It could be a woman. And they're like, oh, how can you say it could be a woman? Right. And then I'm like, well, to me, it looks like it could be a woman. And so then I look through the witnesses who were on the steps, and I'm like, what about this one, Sarah Stanton? She doesn't, we're not sure where she was standing. And then they're like, well, it couldn't be her because she said she was this. And I'm like, well, do we have an identification of her in the films and photos of her being anywhere else? No. Well, then what's to say that's not her? Bill Fraser says she was by him on the steps. Well, he said she was to his left or whatever. And I'm like, that might have been 10 seconds later. We don't know. They're not glued in place. Like, anyhow, so I just kind of like walked away from it, but it just kept building. So soon this whole, I called it a religion. Maybe that was unfair, but this cult, no, that's unfair too. But people rose up saying like, yeah, that's it. It's Oswald. It's got to be Oswald. And they say, look, he's holding a Coke bottle in his hand. And then, I don't think he's holding. It's too blurry. You cannot tell. And then so it just progressed from there. And I've never been a believer. And then I just saw where it spirals. It spirals. So then people were like, well, if he's out there, why did they say he was in the break room? Well, clearly they were lying. And I'm like, oh no, now this is going too far. I was already, skeptical, but by that point I was disgusted because Oswald's being in the break room at that time and being calm and not out of breath was always used as one of the key reasons to suspect he was not the shooter on the 6th floor. And now these are guys saying the whole thing was fabricated and never happened. And I'm like, wait, so Roy Truly and Marion Baker, two guys, otherwise there's no real reason to think that they're part of this plot, are involved with this huge, crime to implicate Oswald as the shooter by saying they saw him 4 floors away acting calm. I'm like, that's not how it works. You know, it's if they're gonna implicate him, they would have saw. Why not just say he was on the 5th floor running down, or why not just say they saw him? You know, he was on the 6th floor and he said he was pulling an order and they let him go. There would be so many other better lies than to say they saw him in the break room, you know, acting calm. And so the whole prayer man thing and the whole thing of the break room thing being fake. And when you look at it piece by piece, you see how people have cherry picked. Like there's a newspaper report that came out where they talked to what's it, Ocas Campbell. Was he the president of the Texas School Book? I don't remember his title, but one of the bigwigs at the Texas School Book Depository. And they're like, somebody asked him.
You mean at the time?
Yeah, he worked with
Was
Roy.
it not?
One of the top guys with Roy Truly.
Well, I don't know. I don't know his name.
Anyhow, he was outside during the shots with like Roy Truly, but he didn't run in with the motorcycle cop Marion Baker, right? So he walked in afterwards, and anyhow, so he was interviewed because it was his building, about the building, and he said something about, oh, Oswald was seen in a closet or something like that. Okay, but it's clear when you look at it, he was just repeating something like what he'd heard. He said the policeman stopped him when he was by a closet or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's secondhand information that he's just sharing with the police based upon the lunchroom encounter. But then they're like, oh, he wouldn't lie. It must be true that Oswald was really found in a he was by the front entrance by a closet or something. I can't remember exactly the whole thing, but you see this kind of stuff all the time where they take one statement in a newspaper report. And everybody knows that the early newspaper reports are largely wrong. I mean, there's so much crap in them. When I talk about my website a lot. Not just the early news reports, early TV reports. There's all sorts of stuff about a machine gun being fired, about a man and a woman suspected of being the shooters or whatever. There's all this stuff based upon, the Franzens jumping down on the grass or whatever, or up by the arcade. You could piece together later usually what they were talking about, but to go back and take all that stuff, like I've seen people make a list of all the bullets that were found in the school, in the plaza, and a lot of them people were like, yeah, I think he picked up a bullet. They say, okay, there's a bullet, and they're like, oh, there was a frag. Okay, and they'll be like, wow, there was 12 bullets that were found, or whatever, and it's just taking all these early news reports, that are just so unreliable. And they're interesting. I refer to a lot of them because, I'm not going to say Posner himself, but there have been a lot of people on the Lonut side of the fence who will tell you that all this talk of conspiracy was drummed up afterwards. And it was drummed up by, Jim Garrison and Oliver Stone, or starting with Mark Lane and Jim Garrison and Oliver Stone. These people all drummed up all this stuff. No, the early news reports are the start of the conspiracy thing, because a lot of them said the shots came from the front. A lot of them said that, that the shooter was on the 5th floor or whatever, and the gun was found on the 5th floor. And a lot of things that are contrary to what was later on believed to be the official story. So they, in their rush to get information out, made a lot of mistakes, and that's part of what confused people, like and I think to this day a lot of the confusion continues because of that early reporting was not solid. And and then you see, if you watch a lot of that early day footage, you'll see like a day later Walter Cronkite will say, well, yesterday I said that the shot must have come from the front, but today I'm saying it. I don't think it is, I don't think that's an actual thing, but that kind of thing happened a lot where they were correcting themselves a day later, hours later. Meanwhile, these impressions have been made on people. I remember, there's a lot of people, because people are so impressionable. I saw something, I don't remember when it was, but where people were asked when they first saw the Skrilla film on TV, and a lot of people would say, oh, I saw it on the day of the assassination. They showed it on TV. Because people are so impressionable. They think, oh, they just showed it on TV. But they did not show it on TV for years, right? And that kind of thing so a lot of the initial impressions indicating that more than one shooter was involved and more than Oswald was involved were created by the media.
Okay, very interesting again. Another question, please, about say you're a member of the Education Forum. There used to be more of them. Now there are fewer of them. Don't you wish there were less infighting among members and more of your community trying to sort things out, separate facts from fiction, and move forward together?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's been very troubling to me because I started out as a newbie there, and like, oh, I can learn from this guy, I can learn from that guy, and then at a certain point, I felt like I was the veteran, and so people would say, "Well, what about this, Pat?" And so I'd share what I thought about something. They don't have to believe me. I don't expect everybody to believe me, but please be aware of the facts of why I believe something, right? But then some people don't, they want to believe in that exciting theory of, oh, the CIA is behind everything and the CIA has covered everything up. And, I was recently told by a veteran, somebody who's been on the education forum for a long time, that he's convinced that the CIA controlled the autopsy. And I'm like, what evidence is there for that? I don't even think there's a single CIA person at the autopsy. If you want to go after a boogeyman, I said, go after the military. The military ran the autopsy, right? They were there to watch it. There was all sorts of military people there. The doctors doing it were military. But why? So this CIA boogeyman stuff. So because these people are obsessed with the CIA as the boogeyman, which could be true, but I don't think so. I think John Newman is leaning towards the military at this point, and he's really looked into the assassination in a organizational way. He's not an expert on what happened in the Dealey Plaza or the medical evidence or any of that stuff. But as far as an organizational way, he looks at the documents of who was likely to be involved in an operation of that kind, and I think he's noticing that the military is the most likely to be involved. Operation Northwoods, maybe it's been exaggerated, but it's still really interesting that the military was proposing fake attacks on American soil in order to justify attacking Cuba. And the fact that they were that desperate and were willing to potentially kill innocent people is something that should be eyebrow raising. Here, I'll raise my eyebrows. But they anyhow, but no, the CIA is the boogeyman, and some people are just convinced of that, and everything has to be through that filter, and it's depressing. So people at one point, a small clique of people, but were very vocal, were really going after me about 10 years ago, saying that I was CIA related. I must have been, influenced by the CIA and stuff. And I'm, oh God, because you know why? Because I was trying to downplay all this stupid stuff about the CIA by saying maybe not stupid, paranoid stuff about the CIA, that my friend's mother worked at the CIA at one point in her life, and then she became a housewife. And I used to have, dinner at their house all the time. And most people working at the CIA are just like that. They have a job, they go do it, they type stuff up. They're not, oh, let's overthrow the American government so that we, the CIA, can run things. And then, have our leader replaced every 2 years by a new president. I mean, come on. If it was the FBI, where you have J. Edgar Hoover, who's this monolith who's there for 50 years, it makes a lot more sense. But the CIA, where you have these constantly rotating leadership, I don't think that they work as a block like that. A couple of rogue members using their CIA skills and their CIA contacts, that makes sense. But the CIA as an organization does not make a lot of sense when you look at the history of the organization. It's constantly changing. When Alan Dulles was in charge, that's the closest. That's the closest, because he was there for 7 or 8 years. But for the most part, no. Most of the history of the CIA, it's like a revolving door. I don't remember what the question was, and I don't remember if I answered it, but I hope I did.
Yes, you did. Oh, yes, you did. Oh, yes, very deeply. I'm just very, very happy about all your answers. One last question I would like to ask. if it was not Oswald who killed Kennedy, so if it was some sort of covert operation, at least a conspiracy, someone killed Kennedy. Why? My question is, why was Kennedy killed? Was it because Lyndon Johnson wanted to have a war in Vietnam? I don't know. I'm asking.
I think I don't have a clear-cut answer for that. There's several groups that have motive, and I do think that for a long time to counter. I think Jim Garrison might have been the first one to really push it, but then Peter Dale Scott and then Oliver Stone, that JFK's policy in Vietnam could have been an a reason for his murder. It could have been. I don't know if it was, but it could have been. And there was definitely a knee-jerk reaction in the media to the movie JFK, where these people were coming out of the woodwork to saying like, oh no, his policy was exactly the same as LBJ's. LBJ followed exactly what JFK was going to do. And now we know that that's total BS, not true. Oh, BS, by the way, is, English short for Merida. Is Merida there?
Exactly, yes.
My pronunciation is probably not correct. Anyhow, but it's nonsense. So yes, so JFK's policy was different. He didn't have an interest in sending American troops, ground troops, to Vietnam. He was tired of even having the secret special forces there. He at a certain point, special forces are like supposed to train and help, and then they get the hell out of there. A few stay on to try to keep things organized, or keep running smoothly or whatever. But they're not supposed to be like an army of special forces. They're supposed to guide other forces. And I had a friend who was a lieutenant colonel in the special forces. So we talked about that. And one time he got really mad at me because I said, "Well, aren't you the CIA's, basically the CIA's division of the army or whatever?" And he's like, "No, no." I said, "But don't you guys do work for the CIA?" "Well, sometimes, but no, we do not work for the CIA. We're not CIA." Anyhow, but he believed Oswald probably didn't do it. When we talked about the sniping and the shooting, he's like, "No way." He says, I took Marine Corps basic training, and I was a pretty good shot. I couldn't hit 3 moving shots, at that distance with an old bolt action rifle. He's like, "No." He says, "No, I don't believe it at all." Because initially, a lot of people are told, they're shown one picture and they said one shot, right? "Oh, could you have done that shot?" He's like, "Yeah, I can do that shot." But then when they're told there's 3 shots in a matter of seconds, then a lot of people are like, I don't know, and that rifle, I mean, the FBI even testified that when they did the rifle, they had to take their eye off it and then come back and refine the target. Now, there was a guy on YouTube who'd spent years doing it, and he was like, I said, "Well, you probably, everybody," and he got mad at me, and then he admitted, "Oh yeah, I spent 20 years teaching myself how to fire without taking my eye off the target." Well, no one believes Oswald spent more than a minute, practicing doing the bolt without taking his eye off the target or whatever. Anyhow, so I got sidetracked again. I'm sorry. I was talking about.
The question was, why was he killed?
Oh, why was he killed? Yes. So I don't believe. I suspect. Okay, if I was going to write a play in which I explain what happened, it would go something like this. There are forces in play, like maybe the mafia. They're like, okay, we'd like to kill this guy, and they know that the Cubans working with him would like to kill that guy, and then they're like, but we can't do it if LBJ is going to come after us. And so then they go to somebody, and then somebody says to LBJ, if you ever want Kennedy to be taken care of, it can happen, right? To which LBJ is like, no, it's okay, it's okay. But then, if you look at the history, LBJ was being investigated. Within a few weeks, his career probably would have been over within a few weeks. It was minor by today's standards, but back then, people were testifying before Congress that they bribed LBJ. And there was also a guy that I think I found that Robert Kennedy was having people look into the fact that there was a guy who testified that he actually did cash payouts to LBJ on behalf of the mafia, right? When LBJ was as senator. So not as vice president, but as senator, that he'd taken bribes from. Anyhow, so this stuff was all kind of coming together that maybe LBJ was going to get forced from the ticket. I don't think JFK was just going to drop him from the ticket. But I think that Robert Kennedy was probably going to pursue this information, follow what was going on in Congress, this investigation into LBJ's corruption, Bobby Baker scandal is what people call it, and force LBJ out. And LBJ knew that if he wanted to be president and he wanted to avoid jail or disgrace, anyhow, he needed to give those guys the nod. So I think that LBJ probably, but some people say, oh, LBJ planned it. Oh, come on. I don't think LBJ planned anything in his life. I mean, I think he was brilliant. My understanding of LBJ is that he was brilliant at getting on the phone and saying, like, well, you can see it on the tapes or hear it on the tapes, where he puts together the Warren Commission, or he says, oh, I need you to do this for me, brother, or whatever. Like, you're my brother, or you're going to be my man on the commission. All this stuff. He was a great manipulator. He was probably, as far as maybe even a genius manipulator and getting things done. But as far as getting a piece of paper out and going like, this needs to be done, this needs to be done, this guy needs to do this guy, he wasn't going to do that. So I think that LBJ probably gave the wink, wink, nudge, nudge to someone, and it happened. And that's what I think he was terrified of, that, the fact that he probably was responsible. So he may not have known for sure that he was responsible, but I think he was haunted by the fact that he might have been responsible. Because like towards, I get into this on my website. After he left office, he wrote a memo. Everybody pretty much does that. And he wrote this memoir, and he did tapes for the memoir, and some of the stuff was cut out. But then some of the tapes were eventually released by the LBJ Library, and some newspaper reports were on them. And in these tapes, he says things like, yeah, Bobby Kennedy would have had me behind bars if it wasn't for Earl Warren saving my butt, or whatever. Like, what? So he was convinced. To certain people, he said that, we have to, find that it was just Oswald, because otherwise, we might have World War III because the Russians or whatever. But his big fear really was that Robert Kennedy was going to pin it on him. And I think maybe it might have been a guilty conscience that he might have been involved. So,
okay, well, fascinating. But I want to thank you very much, and sincerely, thank you very much for a high quality conversation and a high quality interview. I think your answers were very articulate and reasonable, lots of common sense, lots of information. I learned a lot, and I want to thank you very much for that. I'm very proud to have been able to have that conversation with you. And again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Glad to get to know you a little bit better.